Most people think dominance is something you do in front of others. They're wrong. Real dominance is something that happens inside other people. It begins when your presence creates mental gravity. When people adjust their tone before you speak. When they rehearse what they'll say to you. When they feel a subtle pressure to be precise, controlled, careful. That pressure is not fear. It's orientation. You've entered their internal map. This is how the mind becomes occupied. When someone cannot predict you, they monitor you. When they monitor you, you lead. The mistake most people make is trying to be understood. Understanding invites evaluation. Evaluation invites judgment. Judgment invites challenge. Machiavellian dominance avoids this loop entirely. You don't aim to be understood. You aim to be registered. Registered as calm. Registered as unmoved. Registered as someone whose reactions are not easily purchased. The human brain is efficient. It looks for patterns to conserve energy. When it can't find one, it slows down. It becomes cautious. It begins to self-regulate. That self-regulation is submission without awareness. Silence plays a crucial role here, but not the silence of withdrawal. This is structured silence. Silence that arrives exactly where a reaction is expected. Silence that forces the other person to finish the interaction alone, inside their own head. They replay the moment. They adjust future behavior. They reduce risk. You've done nothing visible. Yet the environment has changed. This is why dominant figures rarely argue. Arguments flatten hierarchy. They place minds on the same plane. You cannot occupy a mind you're busy wrestling with. Instead, you let others argue with the idea of you. That idea becomes heavier than your words. Over time, something subtle happens. People begin adopting your pace, your restraint, your standards, not because you told them to, but because systems align with what feels stable. Chaos resists control. Stability attracts imitation. Machiavelli understood that power spreads not by force, but by reference. When people start asking themselves, how would he respond? Before acting, the occupation is complete. You're no longer reacting to the environment. The environment is reacting to you. And the most dangerous thing about this kind of dominance is that it leaves no fingerprints, no conflict, no enemies, no visible struggle, just a quiet recalibration of social gravity. When you're ready, say continue, and I'll deepen this into how this occupation becomes permanent, how people carry your influence forward even in your absence. Once the mind is occupied, it begins to work for you, even when you are absent. People start anticipating you. They slow their speech before addressing you. They edit their opinions internally. They reconsider impulsive behavior, not because of rules, but because of consequence they can't fully articulate. This is the moment dominance becomes self-sustaining. You no longer need to assert anything. The other mind enforces limits on itself. This happens because humans fear social miscalculation more than open conflict. When they don't know where the line is, they assume it is closer than it might be. Caution increases. Precision increases. Respect emerges as a defensive adaptation. You've created psychological terrain, and terrain controls movement. At this stage, the most important discipline is restraint. The instinct to use this dominance is dangerous. The moment you exploit it openly, you reveal the mechanism. Once revealed, it can be challenged. Machiavellian power remains effective only while it feels natural. So you remain ordinary in behavior, but extraordinary in control. You don't correct people unless necessary. You don't chase validation. You don't rush to clarify misunderstandings. Misunderstandings are useful. They force others to think about you longer than they think about themselves. Time spent thinking about you is time not spent resisting you. Gradually, people begin aligning with your standards. They adopt your rhythm. They mirror your calm. They lower emotional noise around you. Not out of loyalty, but out of adaptation. This is how influence spreads without persuasion. The most powerful moment is when someone defends your position without you being present. Not because you asked them to, but because your frame has become their reference point. At that point, you are no longer interacting at the level of personality. You are operating at the level of structure, and structures don't need to speak. As time passes, the occupation either deepens or decays. There is no neutral state. Most people lose dominance, not because others attack them, but because familiarity erodes asymmetry. When people feel they fully understand you, they stop calibrating themselves. When they feel safe predicting you, They stop respecting the unknown. This is why Machiavellian influence is never static. It must be maintained through controlled opacity. You don't become distant. You become unresolved. You allow people to know your behavior, but never your inner logic. They can observe what you do, but not why you do it. This forces their minds to keep running simulations. And a mind that is simulating is not challenging. One of the most subtle mistakes is emotional transparency. When others can track your internal state easily, they stop respecting your boundaries. Predictable emotions invite manipulation. They teach others where to press. Instead, you regulate expression without suppressing feeling. Your reactions remain measured. Your approval remains understated. Your displeasure remains quiet but unmistakable. People don't need to see anger to fear consequences. They only need to see that crossing a line produces distance, not drama. Distance is expensive. Over time, this creates a psychological pattern. Interaction with you requires care. Care creates respect. Respect creates hierarchy. Another critical element is timing. You do not respond when others expect you to. You do not act at the peak of emotion. You let moments pass. This creates a delay between action and consequence, which is deeply unsettling to the human mind. Immediate feedback feels manageable. Delayed feedback feels dangerous. The brain prefers fast punishment to slow uncertainty. When uncertainty dominates, people self-correct aggressively. This is how you occupy mental bandwidth without effort. They think about what they said. They think about what they should have said. They think about how you interpreted it. You are absent, yet present. And slowly, a shift occurs. People stop interacting with you casually. Conversations become purposeful. Requests become more respectful. Disagreements become cautious and framed. Not because you demanded it, because the cost of misalignment feels high. At this stage, dominance no longer depends on personality. Even if you say little, the structure remains. Even if you withdraw temporarily, the frame holds. You've moved from influence to infrastructure. And infrastructure does not decay quickly. Once your presence transforms into infrastructure, its effect goes beyond isolated actions. It's no longer about impressing, intimidating, or manipulating in specific moments. It's about creating a field of influence that shapes behavior, even in your absence. People internalize the rules of your psychological universe without needing you to remind them. The coherence of your invisible logic generates self-protection, self-preservation, and self-prioritization. They learn to operate within your boundaries without realizing these boundaries exist, because the pattern has already been absorbed. At this stage, communication is no longer just what is said. Every pause, gesture, and omission carries weight. Silence becomes a message. What you do not share is as powerful as what you express. The human mind fills in gaps. When you leave strategic gaps, others' imaginations work for you. They project intentions, motives, and consequences, and these projections almost always reinforce your position. Predictability becomes the enemy of authority. People who can anticipate your reactions grow bold. They test limits, seek loopholes, calculate smaller risks. But when you maintain controlled unpredictability, you impose a constant cognitive tension. They can never know exactly how you will respond, so they act with caution. This caution breeds deference. Deference solidifies status. Constructing this mental field is delicate. It is not cheap manipulation, nor obvious displays of power. It is strategic consistency. Your actions, words, and even your absence all operate in harmony, reinforcing the same underlying message, engaging with you as costs, aligning with you as benefits, and breaking alignment carries silent but real consequences. Timing is another critical element. It's not only the frequency of interactions, but the rhythm. Mastery of timing transforms simple acts into instruments of influence. By delaying responses, you create anticipation. By choosing the precise moment to act, you maximize impact. By withdrawing, you allow others to reevaluate their strategies. The human mind hates uncertainty, and you can leverage it without saying a single word. Eventually, the psychological pattern you establish begins to operate autonomously. People internalize your logic without needing constant reinforcement. They adjust behavior, tone, and expectations to remain within the structure you have defined. This is the stage where influence no longer depends on presence or performance. It becomes self-sustaining. Your position is maintained not because you constantly assert it, but because it is functional for others to respect it. Dominance, then, ceases to be personal and becomes structural. Every future interaction is filtered through the system you implanted. Deviations are noticed, measured, and subtly corrected by the person's own psychology because the mental structure you created functions as an unwritten law. If you maintain this discipline, the field you occupy grows exponentially. People who have never interacted directly begin to feel the effects of decisions subtly shaped by you. Reputation, expectation, and caution travel ahead of you, claiming territory before you are even present. This is silent power, power that does not rely on charisma, charm, or physical presence. It relies on perception and invisible consistency. Once your influence has become structural, the next step is maintenance. Infrastructure, unlike personality, requires subtle upkeep. It is not about constant assertion, but about strategic reinforcement. The goal is to remain unresolved, never fully known, while being consistently present in perception. People should feel your influence even when you're silent, absent, or disengaged. One of the most powerful tools here is selective visibility. Share actions, but never the full reasoning behind them. Allow people to observe patterns without understanding the underlying logic. When they try to predict you, they are forced to simulate possibilities in their own minds. And a mind that is constantly simulating is not one that challenges. It self-regulates. Another critical element is measured emotional regulation. Predictable emotion is weakness. It is a map of where pressure can be applied. Anger, frustration, or enthusiasm, if displayed openly and consistently, signals exploitable patterns. Instead, your emotions are contained, but evident enough to leave subtle marks. A slight distance after a perceived boundary is crossed, a quiet pause when expectations are unmet, a muted acknowledgement of success. These small signals are interpreted as far more significant than overt expressions. Absence as presence becomes a central principle. By carefully withdrawing from constant interaction, you force others to recalibrate. Without you in the immediate space, they must rely on memory, anticipation, and imagination to navigate your expectations. Their thoughts orbit around your potential reaction, creating mental bandwidth occupied without effort on your part. They run through every conversation, action, and decision, asking themselves, how would they see this? What do they think? Timing remains critical. Immediate reactions are digestible and manageable. Delayed consequences are disorienting and persuasive. When the outcome of an action, approval, denial, reward, or correction, is intentionally postponed, uncertainty grows. The mind abhors uncertainty. It self-corrects. It approaches alignment proactively. You create a system where misalignment is cognitively and emotionally costly, without ever needing to enforce it through confrontation. Gradually, a psychological hierarchy emerges naturally. Interactions with you are no longer casual. They become deliberate. Requests are framed carefully. Disagreements are nuanced and measured. People operate within your influence because the cost of neglecting it is apparent, even if unspoken. At this stage, dominance is no longer tied to your charisma, volume, or assertiveness. It is encoded in the cognitive habits of those around you. Your influence becomes self-reinforcing. It persists in your absence because the mental structures you've created are internalized. This is the essence of silent authority. It is both pervasive and invisible. People respect boundaries they cannot see. They anticipate consequences they cannot measure. They defer to standards they cannot fully comprehend. Your control becomes a force of habit, expectation, and anticipation, infrastructure that resists decay because it no longer relies on constant input. And here is the final layer, legacy of influence. Once the system is established, it propagates. Those who operate within your field begin to encode similar patterns in others, voluntarily transmitting the structure you created. Your influence multiplies quietly, organically, and exponentially. It does not require oversight because it has become self-perpetuating. At this point, influence transcends the individual. You are no longer shaping people. You have shaped the system through which people act, think, and interact. Your presence is felt in behavior, thought patterns, and anticipation, long before you engage, and often without direct interaction at all. This is infrastructure at its purest, invisible, enduring, and absolute. Maintaining this kind of influence over time requires subtle, almost imperceptible adjustments. Infrastructure does not thrive on rigidity alone. It thrives on a balance of stability and strategic disruption. Too static, and people start to predict you perfectly. Familiarity erodes respect. Too erratic, and the system collapses into chaos. Your task is to calibrate this balance continuously, often through the smallest interventions that barely register on the conscious level. One essential tool is strategic inconsistency. This is not randomness, but carefully chosen deviations from expectation. Occasionally act in ways that surprise, unsettle, or defy prediction. Not to intimidate overtly, but to remind observers that your inner logic remains opaque. Each deviation reinforces the mental simulation cycle. They must think harder, anticipate more carefully, and approach interactions with elevated caution. Predictability is a trap for dominance. Controlled unpredictability is a shield and lever. Layered opacity is another key principle. Allow your behavior to be understood on the surface. People must feel like they know you, but never reveal the deeper reasoning. They should see actions, but never trace them to motives. They should see patterns, but never deduce principles. Their minds will construct hypotheses that are almost certainly incomplete or inaccurate. Yet these hypotheses will govern behavior around you. This is the essence of mental occupancy. You dominate attention without speaking, acting, or revealing. Emotion remains a silent instrument of influence. Do not suppress feeling, but regulate its appearance. Subtle shifts in tone, expression, or presence are far more potent than overt displays. A flicker of disapproval, a hint of distance, or a momentary hesitation communicates more than anger or confrontation ever could. People internalize these cues as boundaries and consequences. They learn self-restraint because the cost of misreading your signals is not immediate punishment. It is discomfort, distance, or social recalibration, which is psychologically far more impactful. Control of narrative becomes central over time. You do not argue, debate, or correct constantly. Instead, your silence, your absence, and your carefully measured interventions shape perceptions. People begin to recount your actions and motives to themselves and others, often unconsciously reproducing your frame. Stories about you spread, not because of spectacle, but because of the subtle weight of every interaction. Each retelling reinforces the infrastructure of influence long after the original event. Temporal manipulation continues to be a decisive tool. Delay feedback, responses, or decisions deliberately. Let events unfold without immediate clarification. The human mind seeks closure and certainty. Uncertainty forces it to overanalyze, overcorrect, and preemptively align with your expectations. Immediate reaction is digestible. Delayed reaction is persuasive. Over time, your timing alone becomes a mechanism of compliance, attention, and respect. The long-term result of these practices is autonomous psychological hierarchy. People operate within your influence because it has become cognitively and emotionally efficient to do so. Misalignment carries internalized consequences, social tension, discomfort, self-doubt. Compliance is voluntary, yet compelled. Respect is instinctive, not demanded. Interactions are guided by an invisible architecture that only you designed, yet which now functions independently. Finally, at the apex, influence transcends even perception. New entrants into your sphere unconsciously adopt the same patterns because the system, the psychological infrastructure, has been encoded in behaviors, expectations, and anticipations. Your authority propagates silently, organically, and perpetually. It becomes self-sustaining. You no longer need to assert, remind, or enforce. The structure itself enforces. Influence has become institutionalized within the minds of those around you. This is the ultimate mastery of mental dominance, the point where your presence is felt more in absence than in presence, where your logic shapes thought, behavior, and interaction, all without overt action. You have moved from influence to architecture, from dominance to infrastructure. And infrastructure, when properly built, resists decay.